All set.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is the NBD quarterly meeting work session, and I welcome everyone to join us today via YouTube. And I'd like to turn it over to Commissioner Gary Kirkmeyer. Commissioner?
Thank you very much, Miguel. All right, so this afternoon we do have a pretty full slate. We have the consultant team here that's going to give you an update on the Housing Trust Fund. After that, we'll talk about just a couple of slides on our overall updated development activity. We do want to brief you on the Buy the Block initiative. And then if time permits, we'll talk about where we're at with land management. So at this time, I'll turn it over to our colleague in housing, Leah Anselm, to introduce the consultant team.
Hi. So you've probably seen more than maybe you wanted to of me the last year, where I keep coming and saying we're working on anti-displacement, yay. We're working on a housing trust fund, extremely yay. And I've been teasing you for what seems like forever about how we were going to have a report and we were going to have ideas and recommendations. And I finally am able to ask our consultants to kind of walk you through as quickly as possible, because we have 700 things to talk about, but you know, their findings and some of their recommendations so that we can all feel like, you know, we have a place to go. So HRNA Advisors is with us, Philip Cash, Christiana Whitcomb, and Keely Gaston somewhere. So I'm going to let them kind of move ahead. I know they have a lot of slides, and with the interest of time, they may not touch base on all of them, but I'm sure that they will have that available after if you'd like to, you know, review it much more in depth.
Thank you, Leah, and we will try to, recognizing your packed agenda, we will try to move quickly, but happy to stop and answer questions or follow up as is appropriate, as is useful. Christiana, can you share the deck?
Yeah, is the host able to
Yep.
enable screen sharing? Great, thanks.
You should be good now.
Yep, all set.
So we
Can you
kept
share my
draft
screen?
on.
Oh, sorry.
Yep. We kept draft on all this for the very good reason that all of this is in process. None of this is finalized. We're doing analysis. We're talking to you as we're doing it. So nothing. Always want to have that out there. So what we're going to go through really is just a little quick background on what a housing trust fund is and how it works, and then go through the key components: eligible activities, governance and administration, and then revenue recommendations. So a little background on us as I get into this. HRNA Advisors is real estate, public policy, and economic development consulting firm. Our housing practice is relatively unique in that we do plans and strategies similar to what we're doing with you all. We design anything a plan and strategy might recommend, so an inclusionary zoning policy or a housing trust fund or down payment assistance program or owner-occupied rehab. We also design those programs and help run them. And then we actually do transactions. So think of those as low-income housing tax credit developments, public housing redevelopment, mixed income multifamily. So we work at all three levels, and we think that generally makes us better at what we do, because we have plenty of experience with plans that are not clear on the programs and policies, and plenty of experience with policies that don't actually work for real development or the real world. And so we think it makes us better at what we do. Next slide. Rochester is participating in the Anti-Displacement Learning Network, started in 2020. And through that process, it got funding and hired HRNA to look at how to create a housing trust fund oriented around anti-displacement. And that work is really organized into three broad areas: a needs assessment, revenue study, and recommendations. We've got the first things running into the housing trust fund is just what we mean by housing trust fund. I know that you all talked about this a fair amount, so I apologize where I'm saying something that is obvious or been stated many times, but we always think it's useful to talk about. A housing trust fund is really a pool of money. It's lots of different ways it can be set up, but it's funding. It's usually public, it doesn't have to be, and it's to address housing. There's a broad range of housing issues that can be used to address. Housing trust funds have proliferated across the country, largely because the federal government, with the exceptions of some recent legislation, has stepped back. Funding per capita, especially when you adjust for inflation, has dropped for housing in the US for almost as long as I've been alive. It's been dropping. There was a little uptick during the foreclosure crisis, but generally it's a downward trend if you adjust for capita and for inflation. You know, what do you actually do with housing trust fund? It's a flexible capital because it's local. It's more flexible than state or federal funding. and you really set local policy priorities and deploy the capital, usually in capital projects, but not always, to support housing priorities in the community. That might be home ownership, it could be homeless prevention, or in this case, it's really oriented around anti-displacement. Next slide. So what you need when you're building a housing trust fund is you need to set policy goals. What are the priorities for the community? What is this housing trust fund going to be oriented, and how those goals evolve over time? What things are you allowed to do? You know, where are you intervening in the market? How is it governed and managed? So who's making the decisions? How the day-to-day process run? And then if it's a pool of money, where does that money actually come from? What are the funding sources? That last one's always a tough one. So on the policy side, we were lucky in that the city had already done a lot of thinking. You all had a lot of conversations about this, and you were part of a larger learning network. So there was a fair amount of clarity and good guidance for us. We went out and had conversations with the community, but there was pretty clear guidance straight from the RFP that we were selected through. One is just increasing housing stability, so making sure households are able to stay where they want to, in the homes they're in. Second objective was closing gaps in coverage. There's lots of housing programs in Rochester, but there are still gaps in the coverage in terms of who is eligible or certain needs that are not being met that can really have devastating impacts for households. And then finally, the flexibility. Flexibility is a key driving factor, enough that whatever we created that could adjust to meet the circumstances of the individual household. So it wouldn't be still a government program, but there's a minimum amount of rigidity in that program. And those are guidance points we had really from the get-go. Next slide. As we started to look at where is policy goals, who we're going to serve as a primary part of policy goals, we spent a fair amount of time, and it's laid out in a much longer set of analysis about where is the greatest need. And that's always a tough conversation because there's lots of need in lots of different places, but where's the need that's not being served by the market, that we think not being served by the market, not being served by existing programs that the housing program has the potential to serve. And really we saw female heads of households with children, go right to the top, low and moderate income renters more generally, and senior renters. When we look at both, when we looked at the data and when we interviewed and spoke with people in the community, these three groups moved to the top. Now, it doesn't mean these are the only groups in need. There's very consistent data and discussion on these groups. Next slide.
Thank you very much.
So on the eligible activities side, we started by just looking at what are the spectrum of the types of housing you might get: emergency assistance, transitional housing, all the way to asset building. What we did is we looked at the existing programs in Rochester, available in Rochester. We interviewed landlords, program recipients, service providers, city staff to understand how those programs are working, where they meet needs, where they're not. And then we do this nationally. We looked at best practices and how these things work. From that, we really saw three areas where there was real needs and real potential to have impact. Emergency assistance probably being one of the most pressing, just the ability to stabilize a household in crisis. Always there's, everywhere we've ever worked, there's always been a need for more affordable housing. And then asset building, the actual ability to move yourself up and out of a condition of poverty through the housing process, so that you're not likely to fall back into need. And we identified as a set, and this is more detailed in the final report, but of different types of programs or activities you might engage in. That's what you see a little bit there on the right, but they fall in those three areas. Next slide. So governance and administration. It's important for there's some best practices when you're setting up housing trust funds. As I described, housing trust funds have proliferated in recent years. Many of them are not, frankly, that effective for a variety of reasons, or not well sustained. One of the key points first we make is just formalizing the process to set priority of the funds and allocation of funds. So being clear on how money is going to be allocated and how it's going to be computed for, and the ability to update that over time. That sounds relatively obvious, but frankly, most housing trust funds actually aren't clear. They just say affordable housing, and that's a pretty broad space. Including and empowering community voices. In this is a challenge for any government or public-private partnership action, is how you're reaching out to the community and how that community, who's actually being included in that conversation. So again, I think credit is due the way we were hired, and what we were asked to do is spending time talking to the households who are actually the beneficiaries, the people who are participating in the program, frankly, is the most obvious step, but also the most overlooked. We tried to make sure we looked at that that was something we were asked to do, and we have done as part of this assessment, and something we're going to add, we recommend on an ongoing governance basis. Then the next, ensure flexibility. So making sure that if you put local money into this, that it doesn't get mixed with, it can run in parallel to, but doesn't get mixed with federal money, so that you don't put any federal restrictions on that you don't have to. It's great if you choose to put those restrictions on yourself, but don't let the federal government restrict you with local money. And then obviously building trust. And this usually comes from clear ongoing communications of what was the money allocated to, how was the award process made, what impact has actually been achieved. So it's that communication on via an annual report or clear minutes, but what's actually happening with this going forward here. Next slide. So there's a number of different governance structures that can be set up, and I apologize, there's a lot of this chart, but they're fundamentally come down to led by a city or led by a community partner. Yeah, in either case, city council is going to control the nomination of the advisory board. If it's being led by a community partner, then it's really going to be the community partner and the advisory board that's going to be doing the community engagement. It's going to be the community partner and the advisory board, which might have local government representatives on it. There's going to be setting the annual allocation plan, which is, technical speak for what are the priorities for what we're going to spend the money on that year. So it's actually setting the priorities. Then, and a community partner-led approach, it would actually be the community partner with the advisory board that would be reviewing and selecting applications. These are the two places, like it can be more city controlled or it can be a community partner. A community partner could be a community development financial institution. It could be a philanthropic partner. It could be a quasi-governmental agency, or this can be run more in conjunction within a housing department. There's lots of iterations of it, but those are the two primary directions, and both can work, but there obviously are trade-offs that come with each. Next slide. Regardless of the structure, we set up, if you want a community advisory board, there's some aspects of this. We generally, and this is always a hard thing, but we strongly recommend capping the membership around 15. Everybody wants to participate. You should have these be open meetings so people who want to participate can come, but you want to be expecting and requiring regular attendance. This committee is going to be overseeing your community engagement. So these are, frankly, joining these community means you're going to be making a commitment to go out and talk about the work a lot. You're going to be having the negotiations and conversations and hearing feedback from both nonprofits who might be requesting money, but also from community members who are beneficiary programs about what the annual allocation priorities should be. And then you'll be involved in funding, reviewing and funding the applicants, and then recommending funding level. All of this is emphasis on the word advisory. Boards don't make necessarily they shouldn't be making the final decision, but usually they're covering 9 times out of 10 their recommendations are adopted. And then we make recommendations about who you actually include within the group to make sure it's representative of both those with expertise and the community at large, and those who are participating in the programs. So that's the governance side. I'll talk finally about the revenue side. So any housing trust fund to be successful needs a long-term commitment, dedicated funding to it. And that's always a challenge because there's lots of demands on public funding. And fundamentally what this means on the long-term basis is allocating public funding, reallocating public funding from some other use. There's always another, be it parks or transportation improvements, there's always another use that's frankly often equally valid and important, or raising taxes, which means imposing a burden and frankly can be regressive and harmful at times too. That's fundamentally the other thing that we run into, and we saw this more and why there are not that many housing trust funds, frankly, in New York State, is in New York State really limits the ability of local governments to have the flexibility on their funding sources to use a lot of the tools that we see used in other parts of the country. So it is harder to do this in New York State. Now, on the plus side, New York State does have more resources at the state level than most states, but still not relative to this, nowhere near relative to the scale of need. Excellent. So we're fortunate to be in a good place. To start with is, one, there's seed funding from, there was some seed funding from enterprise community partners, actually through the anti-displacement network that we discussed earlier. And the city has chosen to dedicate a portion of their ARPA funding towards getting this started. And that that's a huge boost. It makes things much easier to start because the initial funding for one of these efforts is always, frankly, always one of the greatest challenges. Next. Then it comes to the next, so that allows you to get started and really gets you going through 2024. But then becomes a question of how you're going to think about ongoing funding sources, because unfortunately the need will still be there long after the seed money has been used. And so what we were asked to look at a whole host of revenue sources, and we did not list them all out here because we go way over time, but we looked at a wide range of revenue sources and started to look at, one, is it legally feasible? Two, is it financially feasible? And then what scale of funding would it how much money could it actually potentially generate? Is it significant? Is it realistic? And we started to get to a set of funding sources that do have potential, and we've identified, but we also acknowledge that all of them, as I said at the beginning, have real trade-offs. Other folks may have claims on them. It means reallocating from a different source, or are more complicated to actually put forward. But we have started to identify those funding sources. That's something that's we think goes on more as a part of the long-term effort with the advisory committee gets set up as you create a housing trust fund. The other thing, whenever we talk about money, is okay, we're going to spend public money to achieve public good, or maybe philanthropic mission money. What are we talking about in terms of impact? So we looked at some of the different programs we were getting into for emergency cash assistance for stabilization, landlord repair fund, legal services, owner-occupied rehabs, case management support, match savings account on the asset building side, a series of different programs. And when we looked at the ways those programs are being run currently in Rochester and how they run in other places to get a cost, what kind of resources would this take per household? And then given the level of funding we're talking about, what range of impact are we talking about? As we were going through this, and this could certainly get adjusted as adjustment gets done, we skewed less towards capital projects, building new, bricks and sticks, building new affordable housing because there are existing funding sources there, and more towards services because that's where there seem to be more gaps. It also is an area that lets you touch a lot more households overall. So talking about touching, up to 2,000 a little bit less than 2,000 households with the initial investment, that's a significant number of households. That's a significant impact. We have no idea what the annual, there's all kinds of decisions that can be made about dedicated ongoing funding, but if you ended up with a number around 2 million, you're talking about having an impact of over 1,000 households annually. So these are significant levels of impact. We look at Rochester's overall population and the size of the population in need. Next slide. So I went through that extremely quickly, and I apologize with speed, but hopefully it was helpful. We have a full report, and we're working towards finalization on this, but happy to answer questions if there are any.
So I'll open it up to council members for questions.
I have a question.
Councilmember Lupien.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted clarification on the last slide. Is that the breakdown that you're recommending?
No, not it's a hypothetical breakdown. I'm happy that we should label this more clearly, and that's my mistake.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to have an illustrative example. We think it's something along with what we had is something along these lines. You could have part of what your advisory committee would be doing is they would be making a firmer set of recommendations on this. So you might adjust it quite significantly.
Got it. Thank you.
But we wanted to get something on scale.
I have a quick.
Any further question?
Yeah, I have maybe two quick questions, hopefully. One, we as a city have a track record of doing things like, roofing grants and other types of grants like that. Would you recommend moving forward that all of those dollars get bucketed into the Housing Trust Fund, or is there utility in keeping some of those things separate?
So some of that funding is federal funding, and if it's federal funding, we definitely would want to allocate in coordination, but keep the allocation processes separate, just for the comment made about putting federal requirements on here. For the efforts that are not federally funded, I would generally lean towards leaving it where it is because you have a process that works and wouldn't change your award and selection process. I don't know that I know enough on the specifics to have a strong opinion. My default position would be to leave it where it stands.
Got it. I
and
mean,
not move it.
I think the vast majority of those funds are federal. So and the reason to keep them separate is because of just different regulations and requirements. But the goal would be potentially to have this advisory committee, et cetera, think through how to allocate the funding in coordination with whatever else happens that is related.
And part of like what we recommend, yes, 100% correct. Part of what we recommend in the governance structure is that advisory committee is you want government representatives on the committee. Maybe you can have rules about whether they can vote or how they can vote, but you want them there because you want them talking about, great, you're going to allocate, you're recommending this, but we have these other programs. So let's make sure we're not duplicating. Let's make sure we're coordinating. Frankly, let's just make sure people understand the good things the city's doing because they don't always know. But so that's part of the mechanism for making sure there's coordination and leverage where they can. Because like it might actually go, sorry to dig into a rabbit hole, but it might actually go the other way. Like I don't know this works as much for the roof example, but you might decide that you're going to take and move some of your housing trust fund money over towards the roofing program because by doing that, you can leverage money from the Federal Home Loan Bank or some other competitive grant process that actually let you have more impact. So
Got it.
It might move the other way occasionally, but that would partially where that advisory committee would be like, hey, we've talked this through and we think this is a good idea and here's why.
Got it. One more question from your experience in other cities. I would imagine this is actually something that would be very attractive for private philanthropy to invest in. I've heard private philanthropy talk quite a bit over the years about wanting to invest, wanting to assist in larger housing issues. But of course, these major foundations are only going to work with 501c3s, and that makes it hard to work on individual people's homes, et cetera, et cetera. Is there, maybe you don't have to answer the question now, in the report, is there talk about the mechanics of connecting private philanthropy to the Housing Trust Fund? Are there good examples of that in other places?
Yes and no. So yes, we talk about it, and part of the reason why you might go with a community partner for an affordable housing trust fund is it's in a way for it to pull in both public and philanthropic funding into one location. You can also have it where you're just the philanthropic side and the public side are actually just on the same committee and they're coordinating with each other. So there's both, there's different ways to solve it. There are examples of where philanthropic money comes into a housing trust fund. I will say that they're relatively limited, that the philanthropic sector generally is not willing to make an ongoing large, I'm generalizing here, I'm talking about a whole industry, generally is less willing to make an ongoing commitment to grant funding for these purposes. There are lots of funds where it's set up where the philanthropic sector is putting in low cost capital, but they expect to get paid. So like 2% interest loans and things like that. There are some on the grant side and there's some coordination on it. But again, I don't want to like over Johnson. I also think like part of what we're talking about here is something that leads a little bit outside of normal housing space. We're trying to stabilize people's housing situation. So emergency cash assistance and quick housing stabilization. There are a number of places where United Ways or similar nonprofit organizations raise capital for that on the philanthropic side and then use it in coordination with the public sector, almost more on the closer to the service side.
Got it. Thanks, that's helpful.
Great, thank you. So if there's no further questions, I appreciate the update on this. I've been involved with it, and I know that we've made a lot of progress already in moving this along. So thank you for the presentation, and I'd like to turn it back to Commissioner to move us along on the agenda.
All right, thank you. All right, so I'm going to try to share. Oh, I need to share my screen here if I could.
You should be able to now.
Yep, got it. Let me see, are you seeing that or no?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so just quickly, I'm going to go through this. Last time we did a development update was, I think, March. This is the data that follows that. So we want to try to continue to do this. I think it's important for NBD, I think, to do this. But is somebody saying something? No. I think it's important that NBD does this at least on an annual basis, just to give you a glimpse of how this wonderful development is still really outpacing any expectations, especially given the pandemic. So the data here from July 1st, 2020 through this data was put together in September for a presentation to the senior management team. There are 368 building permits with a construction value over 100,000, with 120 of them valued at more than 500,000, and a total construction value of all permits issued during that time of almost $394 million. So despite the pandemic shutting down some construction activity, despite the increased cost of supplies, during the 2021 fiscal year, we were up 18% higher than the budgeted amount of permit fees and 7% higher than the previous five-year average. And then just to, we kind of tied this to the mayor's term here. So 2014, since that time, there's been over 2,900 new units added to the city. Lots of others rehab, totally gut rehab, but 2,902 new units. At the same time, we've seen a 44% reduction in the number of vacant structures. I think the combination of those two things can tell most people that it's apparent that at least our family unit equivalent seems to have increased. If you're dropping vacancies at the same time that you're adding units, there's something happening there. So 2014, our construction values are up on an annual basis over 116% over this previous 7-year period. And then this year, our housing RFP process, we had 17 projects submitted. That's way more than we typically see. And then just to give you a visual, if you will, of where these $100,000 plus permits have been issued. Again, you've seen similar things in the past presentations where it's not all Center City. It's almost evenly spread out citywide, but it certainly touches every quadrant. Now, typically, we would have followed this up with 50 slides or so of currently finished or current underway or current about to be underway projects, but we knew we wouldn't have time for that today. So that's the end of that update. We do have that. We can provide that to you if you want to see visual evidence of what's going on in the city. I assure you that it's happened both residential, commercially, and throughout the city, the developments going on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our housing specialist, Lindsay Nabozny. She's going to take you over and talk about the Buy the Block program. But I just want to start the Buy the Block conversation with just reminding council, I think we've had this conversation previous, but all the programs that we're developing in ARPA, whether it's the rehab program, the roof program, what you haven't seen yet, the mixed use commercial corridor rehab program, the business revitalization grant program, and certainly the Buy the Block initiative. Our intent is to focus a portion of those efforts all to help holistically and completely lift up a neighborhood. So Lindsay, if you want to take it from there.
Sure.
Gary, can I just ask one question?
Yeah.
With all that you just described, you must be surprised too that the census only showed a 600 person increase for the city of Rochester. Do you have any sense of what that was? Is it just a bad census process, or what do you think?
Well, I think we all have some doubts about the way the process went, but all I can tell you is these are factual statistics, hard, factual, true statistics. And I think common sense tells us that does paint a different picture than the count established, but it's just data. Lindsay?
Thank you.
Sure. So to just a quick by the block refresher. I won't go into it too deeply. As the commissioner stated, it's really a holistic effort to uplift a neighborhood. A major component of this program is the new construction of single family owner occupied homes for households earning at or below 60% of area median income. And it will also include rehab assistance for existing housing, assistance for businesses and mixed use buildings along commercial corridors, and really just what needs to be done to uplift an area, since we do have this opportunity with ARPA funds. So we have done our initial neighborhood selection for the first phase of the project. At this point, it's really data driven. We focused on formerly redlined areas where there are a large number of vacant city-owned lots that are zoned residential. We wanted an area that is near to and could leverage other recent development and investment in the area. And so there will be, additional phases of the project on the road, but here is the first one. I think these lines got a little bit shifted, but the green area will be the by the block subject area. It's really roughly bounded by Upper Falls Boulevard, Joseph Avenue, Clifford Avenue, and Hudson Avenue. As you can see, it's very nearby Pueblo Nuevo, Edna Craven Estates, and the project the First Genesis is working on is right nearby. These blue, the blue lots on the map there are vacant city-owned land. It's not going to look exactly like this once we start, working on it, because there will be some subdivision and combining of lots and also some environmental due diligence to ensure that, these are all ready for development. So the next slide. So where we are just planning wise, next up is community outreach. We've identified this area just by looking at what's available. Next up, we're going to walk the area with neighborhood groups, work with faith-based organizations such as First Genesis, and also distribute informational flyers to neighborhood residents, really beginning that focused rehab and roof grant effort that will be happening in conjunction with the new construction. And then soon after, in December, we plan to issue a design RFP for the single family homes. We are going to be looking for 3 at least design proposals from each builder or developer. Proposals will be due in mid-January, and then designs will be selected in February. We'll hope to come to you for approval in April of 2022, with construction starting in June 2022. And the first part of this is really going to be model homes. So, each builder that builds, let's say 3 models, they'll build their first 3 models. They'll open in the fall of 2022. And then that will really be an opportunity for prospective buyers to come through and actually see the homes that they would be able to purchase. In the meantime, they'll also be working with our home buyer staff. And ideally then, they'll be able to plan ahead to buy homes in the next phase, the end of the phase, I should say, the additional 20 or so homes that will be completed in fall 2023. That's where we are right now.
So, we can entertain questions now, or we can go through land management and deal with questions after that. Makes no difference.
Let's continue.
Oh, okay.
Oh, Councilmember Harris, go ahead.
I have a quick question. I know that this is the By the Black program, but I did zero in on the comments about funding for businesses. And can you kind of talk a little bit more about what that looks like? Because I know that small business in our neighborhoods have had a hard time getting funding or grant funding because there's so many stringent guidelines, and those guidelines are so strict because it's federally mandated. So the city's hand is tied. You have to follow those because the city acts as mostly as an administrator for those funds. So what can this funding do to help those small businesses, if in fact it does?
Yeah, our hope and our intent is for it to make a difference, right? And to cover these bases that historically have not been covered. So, it's going to be somewhat dependent on what the associated federal regs are associated with the ARPA funds. We're hoping that those are far less stringent than other HUD funds that we get our hands on. But the combination of the business revitalization grant that council approved last month or this month, can't remember when it went, and then when we come to council probably in January for the commercial corridor mixed use rehab grant program, we believe that the combination of those two programs will be able to put us in a position that we historically have never been in terms of helping people both start a business and expand business. And really, in association with the Race Commission and the Ruby Initiative, try to lift up folks that don't typically have access to resources to pursue their dreams.
Thank you. I mean, I really like what I'm hearing about what the By the Block program. It's very I'm uplifting. I'm looking forward to that. And I also like to see or like hear more about how people can get funding for small business or startups. And also, I'm also looking at what we can do to use some of this funding to help folks break into the marijuana business. That funding could be used to help those folks who are legacy business owners to start their new journey on getting their jump on that.
Absolutely. We're of the same mindset. I think that's the intended purpose. As soon as we have locally developed what the expectations are for, hopefully we'll have some local authority in terms of who gets licenses in that realm and who doesn't. And then from there, trying to work with, a focused population of people that we want to help and serve them in their efforts to obtain those kind of business licenses. So yeah, absolutely. What we'll do moving forward with the business specific grant, we're working on a media rollout. Having our last meeting with council, I think it was Vice President Lightfoot who asked to participate in getting the word out. So we certainly will keep council in the loop and welcome the opportunity for council and for all your touches in the community to spread the word and get the word out that those are available funds because we want them to be accessed. And we want them to make a difference.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Great job to everyone else on the team as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
I also have a question.
Commissioner?
Yep.
Okay, Councilmember Lupia.
Well, two questions. One, for the businesses, I know one type of business that is really kind of not really qualified for any of the grants previously is mixed use. So the business, the owner of the building is a landlord, but also has commercial tenants, but isn't necessarily characterized as a business owner. So wondering if there's something for those, because, thinking of Culver and Parcells, we have, I think there's 6 commercial tenants and then apartments above, and they've really been struggling to be able to update that building.
Yeah, so I mean, that's our intent, right? So the commercial corridor mixed use rehab program is intended to go and address some of these properties that, you're right, historically we didn't have any resources for them. They're owned by landlords typically, and there just wasn't resources. So the way that we see this having a 2-pronged compounding impact is, especially if they have commercial vacant spaces, is to be able to raise the quality of the property, make it look better on our commercial corridor, and at the same time avail that space to our intended targeted population of business operators.
I think that's really great. Second question is, in terms of actually selling the houses to our residents, is that going to go through Home Rochester? What will that process look like?
I don't know that we've truly defined that yet, but we certainly are going to have to do a lot of marketing and outreach to the community. We're going to have people know that it's there, know that they can get in line, know that I think in a preferred manner, I think we would love to have people, go through home buyer assistance to qualify to get in line. And then, we know the supply is always going to not be as much as the demand. So it's going to be probably at some point have to be some version of a lottery. But, we do want to make sure that we have a healthy population of people that are interested, express an interest, and then we position them to be ready to be a recipient.
Thank you.
Okay.
So Commissioner, one question before we move on to land management. In terms of identifying neighborhoods to do this in, I know we clearly have the first phase here. Has there been some preliminary ideas about what other neighborhoods this might end up in?
Yeah, I mean, we do know where the data tells us to look, but we have not perfected the data beyond that. In this particular area, we crunched a lot of data to give us guidance here. And one of the things we're kind of swimming upstream, if you will, against is, we have a housing market study, and you're going to see a rental market study that CZB, the same consultant that did our housing market study, did for ESL. And they're not gonna say, there's areas that are so challenged you shouldn't invest in them, but they're gonna say, if it says more likely, if you do so, you've got to do more than just do infill housing, right? You got to do more than rental housing. You've got to do things that are constructive and purposeful and inclusive and holistic to kind of, expand our, if we want to categorize areas as A through D, and we're trying to create more C and above, then we want to keep, as Lindsay alluded to, building off of our investments, building off of the successes we had, spreading the C out, hoping to raise it to B, trying to attract, people's attention to that, and kind of weeding out the D, kind of, pushing it out, if you will. It's going to take a long time, right? But I mean, we have a lot of challenges, but the ARPA funds present an opportunity that honestly just never existed.
All right, thank you. So let's move forward, Commissioner.
All right. So I'll just give you a quick reminder for those of you that don't recall what land management is. But land management is a subject we've been talking about in NBD for 12 years. We still operate in an old legacy mainframe system. It has some wonderful technological use, but it has limitations, and it certainly can't be enhanced. And so what land management is a replacement of that system with a new modern system that is going to serve our customers in ways that they should be served, quite frankly, but they've never been served. And from that perspective, our intent and our purpose is to take the people that are well-versed in our processes out of the permit office counter so that we can spend more time constructively helping those that are not as well-versed in navigating sometimes very complicated processes. And at the same time, provide our staff with enhanced tools to know where we should be focusing our efforts and where we should not be wasting a lot of time. And that's vitally important for improvements to like how quickly we address code violations that, when they're in a pile of 9,000 properties, don't stand out. But when you have a systematic approach in a way and a mechanism for that to indicate in an automated way that, hey, you should be paying attention to this property more frequently, it's going to set our code enforcement structure up to have a lot more success and timely success. So we're very much looking forward to it. And I'm going to turn it over to Jill Simons, who's leading this effort.
Thanks for that overview. So the three systems that we work in primarily and that we're looking to replace through this project are BIS, which is a portion of the mainframe, the inspection system, which overlays the mainframe and is used in the field, and our DCD licensing system, which is an older access database. So we want to modernize the tools, but we also want to, at the same time, modernize a little bit how we operate. So we're implementing a software called Infor Public Sector, or IPS. And we've been working on the implementation phase for about 2 months. So our team at NBD and IT and the project management office are pretty pumped to be at this stage of the game. So on the next slide, just to give you a flavor, if you haven't seen it, this is our mainframe BIS. A lot of people have a lot of affection for that. This is our inspection system, a list of what you have to do in a day, and this is our licensing system. So we're kind of jumping between different systems. So what we want to achieve is imagine being able to apply online after hours, weekends, whenever is convenient, make payments, download an extra copy of something that you need without coming into City Hall. We have a one-stop shop in the permit office, and we're going to create an opportunity for no-stop shopping for those people for whom that makes sense. We also want to streamline the workflow for staff so you can apply and you can get all the way through to your inspection. Everybody can see what's going on, where things stand, and the status of things. And then we want to be able to use data and dashboards to monitor and know what's going on at any given point in our operations. We're working with 2 companies right now in the mix. VIP is an implementation software expert. They're helping us build it out to meet our needs. They're going to help us with training and go live or start using it. And again, Inforce the company from whom we're getting the licenses. It's IPS, help desk, that kind of a thing. We're going to roll this out in 3 phases incrementally so that we can gain experience and test things out and do this in a staged approach. First up is licensing. We're aiming to launch this system in March of 2022. So that's our trade licenses, so plumbing, electrical, stationary engineers, and elevators. Permits is next up. That'll go live in the summer, and then code enforcement is at the end of the year. So these processes we're kind of working in parallel on these different tracks, but we'll, turn the lights on at different points throughout the process. So really the details, the nuts and bolts of the work we're doing right now, we're in discovery sessions with the vendor. We're using an agile framework. So each phase is broken down into sprints or chunks of work. VIP is already configuring it. We're already seeing it on a daily basis, what it's going to look like, how it can work for us. Some of our next steps immediately include communicating with the folks involved in licensing, the license holders themselves, the boards, and the broader public. So getting those meetings scheduled and set up to bring people along with us. And then we'll come back in the new year with minor legislative amendments to enable the use of legislation or digital tools like an online application. Our legislation makes references to handing in a paper copy in the permit office. And we want to also give folks the option to do it online if they so choose.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. That was the last slide. Thank you, Jill. If you have any other questions about that, and just remind you what Jill said, the last bullet is, there will be some times here where we have to come to council to do some code amendments. They're basically to allow us to advance technology and an efficient workflow. So a lot of them will be related to that. We just came across one issue that came up as we're investigating licensing is the state intends to start licensing the elevator industry. They didn't tell anybody, nobody knew, but that's happening as of January 1st, if you could believe that. So we're working with law right now to see if they're going to be in that business, we're probably going to exit that space because we certainly don't want to duplicate effort. We don't want to see our local people put at a disadvantage by having to do duplicate licensing. So, you might see that as early as January, but you'll see some code amendments down the road that are directly connected to land management.
Yeah, so I'll just say that this is very exciting as someone who's poked around online in the various systems and have had some struggles at times, but I think the public will appreciate this in addition to the staff. So this is very exciting work. And I'll entertain any questions. Any questions from council members? Okay. All right, hearing none. Thank you all for this presentation, this update. A lot of exciting work happening in NBD. If we don't see you before the holiday, happy Thanksgiving and have a good night.